I'm live. It is Friday afternoon officially in the South. I am live from the studio, Calix Boxing Studios here in South Louisiana. I hope everyone's having a wonderful week. I hope everybody's going to have a wonderful weekend. I am closing in on 5K subs, 5,000 subs here on YouTube. So please, if you are not subbed, if you're watching this on the archive, which most people are, hit that sub button. Give me the 5K subs. And also, if you're on Twitter, follow on Twitter because I'm closing in also on 1,000 followers on Twitter. So appreciate all the support that we're getting. The archive views are looking great. I appreciate the support. Anybody who's going to show up live, leave a comment in the comment section. Anybody watching in the archives, leave a comment below. Who do you think is going to win this weekend? How do you think the fight's going to play out this weekend? Also, who are your favorite fighters getting inducted this weekend? The Hall of Fame, it's an interesting class because you got 3 classes being inducted in one because of COVID the past couple of years. So you've got this class is Roy Jones, James Toney, Miguel Cotto. Strong class. Floyd Mayweather, Vladimir Klitschko, Andre Ward, last year's class. And the class before that, Shane Mosley, Juan Manuel Marquez, Bernard Hopkins. This makes you feel old because you're starting to see guys that are your age, if you're my age anyway, 40 years old. You're starting to see guys your age, a little older, get inducted into the Hall of Fame. It makes you feel old, but it's also bringing back nostalgia because as I see these names get inducted, I think back to old fights that I came up watching. This is the generation of fighters that I came up watching as a boxing fan. As a boxing fan who grew with the sport, I grew with these fighters being inducted this weekend. Roy Jones. I remember attending Roy Jones fights. I remember watching James Toney come up. I remember being Miguel Cotto's biggest fan coming up. Mayweather, obviously, Vlad Klitschko, Andre Ward. These are guys we came up watching. Shane Mosley, Juan Manuel Marquez, Bernard Hopkins. It's legends in your class. It's legends of your generation. So that's what makes this fun. Before I get into that and the resumes of these fighters being inducted into the Hall of Fame, because I love Hall of Fame weekend, I want to touch on the fights this weekend real quick because this is a sneaky good weekend of boxing, in my opinion. Sneaky good weekend. Berlinga versus Angulo. Berlinga, in my opinion, is on upset alert. He's on upset alert. I think Angulo is a tough Colombian puncher who has a chin. And if you're overvalued, he's going to find you out. He's one of those type of fighters. So this is the perfect step-up fight for Berlinga. Berlinga is a guy who had a padded resume coming up, was just blowing through not-so-good competition, knocking him out, and he was being built up as this monster, the next Puerto Rican star, the next Miguel Cotto type fighter. I don't think Berlinga's that guy. I think if you're looking for the next Puerto Rican superstar, that guy's name is Xander Zayas, not Edgar Berlinga. Berlinga, to me, if you're 20 fights in and you're the guy that they're saying you are, you should have cracked those top 10 rankings at 168 already, because if you look at the 168-pound landscape, it's not that deep. It's a division that has names like John Ryder, Zach Parker, Danny Jacobs is still in the lower end of the top 10. So if you're that dude, you should have cracked into the top 10 by now. Look, Dave Morrell Jr. has already cracked arguably the top 5 in 7 fights at 168. And of course, he had a much thicker amateur background. But if you're that guy, 19, 20 fights in, you should be further ahead than where Berlinga is. And we know everything everything we need to know about a fighter. We can tell by how their handlers handle them and how their how fighters in and around their weight class react when their name is brought up. Nobody really fears Berlinga at the top. I'm sure everybody would jump at the opportunity to fight Berlinga right now in the top 10 at 168. His handlers are handling him like fragile UPS package. He's being brought up softly. So that tells me that they see something in this guy that they don't necessarily like behind the scenes. It tells me that when he fights a guy like Angulo, this is a tough fight for him. I think Berlinga's in tough. I think Berlinga is going to have some issues in this fight. I think he has some trouble going into this weekend. Angulo is a guy, Alexis Angulo. Look him up on YouTube if you haven't. He's a guy who went 10 rounds with the offensive machine, David Benavidez. Was stopped in the 10th round, but he went 10 rounds with him. And Berlinga is a huge step down from Benavidez. Benavidez is an offensive machine, but also, and that's his only knockout loss, but his other loss against Zurdo Ramirez, he went 12 with Ramirez, and Ramirez's punching power has translated up a division at 175. So Zurdo was a good puncher at 168, a good puncher at 175. If Benavidez and Zurdo did not overwhelm Angulo, I don't see Berlinga doing it either. The reason I don't see Berlinga doing it either is Berlinga is a puncher, yes, but Berlinga telegraphs his shots. He doesn't throw any feints. He telegraphs his shot. He's straight up and down. So if you see his punches coming, obviously the power is going to be taken off. I don't think Berlinga's power is going to translate as he goes up in competition. I just don't see that playing out. And Angulo is a step up in competition for him, which is why if you look at the betting odds, he's only a plus 220 underdog. So they're giving Angulo a shot here. He's a live dog in this fight. And the reason he's a live dog is they don't think much of Berlinga. They don't think much of Berlinga. If you look at results, Berlinga by decision is plus 125. Berlinga by KO is plus 200. Angulo by KO plus 380. Angulo by decision is the least likely plus 600. So how do I see this fight playing out? I think Berlinga is going to have some issues when Angulo realizes that, or when Berlinga catches Angulo with some shots and it doesn't really shake Angulo, then we've got ourselves a fight because Angulo can punch too, 23 knockouts and 27 wins. He can crack. But even though both of these guys can crack, even though both Angulo and Berlinga can both punch, even though that's the case, I still like the over in this fight. The reason I like the over is I think Berlinga has a good chin too. Angulo obviously has a good chin. I talked about him going 10 rounds with Benavidez and going the distance with Zurdo Ramirez. If he went the distance with Ramirez, went 10 rounds with Benavidez, then Berlinga is not going to overwhelm him in this fight. And I don't think Berlinga is going to test Angulo's chin in this fight. I think Angulo is going to be fine. And I think we're going to get a closer than people expected decision on the scorecards. I think it will go 12. And I like the over in this fight. I think there's value in the over, even though both of these guys are punchers. But Angulo can crack. So there is the possibility that this fight can end like that. Berlinga can catch Angulo with the shot. Angulo can catch Berlinga with something. That's the interesting thing about two punchers. But I just think the reason that neither one of these guys, even though they both can punch, are on that top level of guys at 168 is because they don't know how to set up those power punches like the other guys at the top of the rankings can. Canelo obviously can do that. Morrell Jr., Benavidez. These guys at the top know how to set up those punches. Charlo, when he moves up to 168. Guys at the top of 168 know how to set up their punches. They know how to throw feints. Berlinga has never thrown a feint in his career. He's just straight up and down. And that's why as he goes up, he's going to have issues. So this fight can go out any kind of way. It's tough to gauge, but I think Berlinga's going to have some issues tomorrow night with Angulo. I think he's going to have. It would not shock me to see Romer, Alexis Angulo shock and upset Berlinga tomorrow night in New York and upset that Puerto Rican Day Parade weekend. The fight tonight, Hiroto Kaiguchi versus Esteban Bermudez. I love that fight. To me, this is the fight I'm looking forward to most this weekend because there's going to be a lot of body punching in that fight. A ton of body punching in that fight. You like body punching, this fight's for you. And this is a second straight weekend where we have a Japanese title holder going on the road to defend their belt. We saw it last weekend with Ogawa against Cordina. Shout out to OJ22 in the building. Appreciate that. Y'all make sure to hit that like as y'all come in, and hit that sub button if y'all are not subbed. But the thing I like about Kaiguchi is he's a body puncher as well. And obviously, Esteban Bermudez being a Mexican, a lower weight class Mexican fighter, he's going to be digging into the body as well. This is going to be a war tonight on the zone in Mexico for Kaiguchi's strap. And like I said, second straight weekend of a Japanese fighter, lower weight class fighter going on the road to defend their belt. Ogawa did it against Cordina last weekend. It did not go well. So Kaiguchi is obviously expecting and hoping things go better for him this weekend than they went for Ogawa last weekend. And I think they will. Although Ogawa was defending his belt last weekend, he was the underdog. In this one, Kaiguchi is the favorite. And he's a minus 450 favorite. So a hefty favorite, and Bermudez is plus 350. So they're expecting Kaiguchi to win this fight. Kaiguchi by decision is the most likely scenario at plus 110. Kaiguchi by KO plus 150. And then Bermudez KO plus 700. Bermudez decision plus 750. So I like in this fight either a Kaiguchi stoppage late or a Kaiguchi decision. But like I said, this thing is going to turn into a war. I think this is one of those. That's why I said this is a sneaky good weekend of boxing, because Berlinga versus Angulo is going to get sketchy for Berlinga. I think he's going to have some issues with Angulo, and that fight's going to get sketchy for him. He's going to have some issues. But also for Kaiguchi going to Mexico, he's going to have some issues as well, and that's going to turn into a war, a lot of body punching. And but I expect Kaiguchi to keep his undefeated record. He's a guy with punching power. He's a guy who likes to go to the body. But both guys like to stand right in front of each other, and you're going to have a lot of shots landed in this fight. I like Kaiguchi in this fight, late stoppage or decision against Bermudez. And then you got Trevor Bryan versus Daniel Dubois. Pay-per-view. Don King pay-per-view. Not watching this fight. I'm not going to pay. The fact that this fight's behind a paywall, hate it. But I expect Dubois to win this fight early. Knock Trevor Bryan out early. I was on the podcast last night with some fellas who said that Trevor Bryan is going to give Dubois some issues in this fight, and it's going to be a closer fight than people expect. I disagree. I think Daniel Dubois is going to ambush Trevor Bryan early and get him out of there in the first 3 or 4 rounds. Now, the over-under in this fight is 3.5 rounds. So Vegas is expecting an early stoppage from Daniel Dubois in this fight. I just happen to think that it's gonna go either way as far as the over-under. But I think Dubois is going to go under, and I think he's going to win this fight in the first 3 rounds. But as far as the Hall of Fame weekend, and I wanted to touch on this real quick. I know it's Friday. People are out and about, but I wanted to get this video out there. And if you're watching this in the archive, sub. I'm closing in on 5,000 subscribers right here on YouTube. So please hit that sub button below if you are not subbed and you're watching this on the archive, and leave a comment below. If you look at this Hall of Fame class, I love this Hall of Fame class. 2 of my favorite fighters of all time, Roy Jones Jr. and Miguel Kodo, are in it. James Toney also in this Hall of Fame class. The interesting thing about watching Hall of Fame classes come through now, as far as modern boxers, is, like I said, it brings more nostalgia, because these are guys you grew up watching. As a 40-year-old, these are guys I grew up watching. Guys my age or older, guys I came of age watching in boxing. These guys are the reason I became a boxing fan. So it brings nostalgia to the table. Last year's class that's also being inducted this weekend. Remember, you got 3 classes being inducted this weekend, 9 fighters, modern fighters altogether. Last year's was Mayweather, Vlad Klitschko, Andre Ward, another strong class. And then 2020, another strong class, Shane Mosley, Juan Manuel Marquez, Bernard Hopkins. Just some names that bring back nostalgia, right? An interesting conversation to have would be, out of those 9 fighters, where would you rank them? Where would you rank those fighters from 1 to 9? Who would you have at the top? Would it be Roy? Would you go with what you saw in his prime? And that outweighs his whole career? Because remember, Roy had a 29-year career. That's an interesting thing about this class is Roy and James Toney both had 29-year careers. You should not be fighting for 3 decades. You should not be fighting for 30 years. And this is why we have in Roy Jones and James Toney guys with multiple losses, because they had these multiple losses late in their career. James Toney has 13 blemishes on his resume. Roy Jones, nine losses on his resume. So you would say, how are these guys this talented have that many L's? One interesting thing to take from this is we're in an era of boxing where guys don't like to lose. Guys protect their O. So an interesting thing to point to in this class right here is Kodo has 6 losses. Roy has 9 losses. James Toney has 10 losses and 3 draws. So combined, that's what? 25 losses and 3 draws between the 3 of them. That's old school. Back in the day, you had great fighters with blemishes, multiple blemishes on their record, because they were fighting guys. They fought for a long time. They fought often. And this is what this class gives you, sort of a throwback feel to it. Guys with a lot of fights on their resume, but guys with blemishes also. So it's something to strive to in this new era is we're not worried about the O. We're not worried about protecting the O. We're not worried about padding records. We just want to see guys fight top competition. And by the way, even if you do, we can point to this class as even if you take multiple L's, you can still go into the Hall of Fame. You can still be inducted into the Hall of Fame. This is what this class tells me is these guys gave us memories. Win or lose, these guys gave you memories. Look at Kodo, my favorite fighter. Some of my favorite memories of him are from losses, to be honest. That first Margarito fight, no matter what we think of it years later, were the gloves, did Margarito have concrete in his gloves? Did he not? Was it a fair fight? No matter what we think of it, at the time, that was a classic fight, a brawl. And there was beautiful back and forth in it. Kodo was outboxing Margarito, but you just saw as the fight went on, as Emmanuel Stewart was telling us as the fight was going on, each round, Margarito was getting closer. Margarito was catching with more shots, and Kodo was just wearing down. His face was wearing down. His body was wearing down. He was having trouble keeping up with output. And as Stewart said during the fight, is Margarito, it's tougher to take pressure fighting from a taller fighter like Margarito. So losses, even in losses, I felt like Kodo gave us a great fight to look back at in the first fight against Margarito. And by the way, he avenged it in the second fight. He had a loss to Saddam Ali. That was late in his career, but lost to Austin Trout. Those are 2 of his tougher losses, right? Late in his career. But Floyd Mayweather, I felt he won 4 rounds in that fight. I thought he handled himself well in that fight. That was supposed to be a huge mismatch. The Pacquiao fight, obviously, this is what I'm saying. Like, there's no issue. There's no shame in losing to guys like Pacquiao, Floyd, Margarito. These are the best fighters in your weight class of that generation. Mayweather, Pacquiao, 2 of the greatest fighters of all time. He had a tough out with Pacquiao, got stopped, but he was competitive in the first 4 or 5 rounds in that fight. But then you look at the wins. Sergio Martinez, becoming lineal middleweight champion, avenging his loss against Antonio Margarito. Ricardo Mayorga, Josh Clottey, when Josh Clottey was undefeated, I believe. No, I don't think Clottey was undefeated, but that was still a good win at welterweight. Shane Mosley, that was a hell of a fight. But one of my favorite Miguel Cotto fights of all time, if not my favorite, is this fight with Zab Judah. I just thought that was a phenomenal fight, back and forth action. Cotto hitting Zab Judah with multiple low blows early in the fight to slow Zab Judah down, and then ultimately stopping him in the 11th round. And that was a beautiful Madison Square Garden, New York brawl between the 2, and beautiful boxing at the same time. High-speed chess. And just seeing Cotto have issues with Zab's speed early in the fight, but then as the fight went on, his pressure and his body punching started to wear Zab down and stop him in that fight. That's one of my favorite fights to watch all time. And that's probably my favorite Kodo fight. Carlos Quintana he moved up to welterweight. First fight, fought undefeated Carlos Quintana for a vacant belt. That's an underrated win right there because Quintana could fight. Malignaggi. Ask Paul Williams, by the way, if Quintana can fight. Malignaggi at 140, underrated win. That was an undefeated Malignaggi. Chop Corley, Randall Bailey. He's got win after win after win on his resume. People exaggerate the redemption Kodo had in the rematch. Margaret was still in it, and they stopped it on cuts. So unsatisfying for the Ricans. The next big Mexico-Puerto Rico match was supposed to be Panchito Bojado versus Kodo. Too bad Bojado's career took a dump, and that it did. Shout out Puerto Sur Central BXO in the building. Floyd versus Kodo, one of my favorite fights. And that was just an underrated action fight because he forced Floyd to go in fifth gear, and Floyd did go in fifth gear, and Floyd hurt Kodo in that 12th round. But Floyd had to go there. And I remember Floyd talking after the fight, like, man, that dude can punch. I was not expecting that dude can punch. And the narrative going in was that Floyd's only moving up to 154 because he doesn't fear Kodo, and Kodo's on the back nine. And that's not what the fight ended up being. And oh, by the way, for a guy being on the back nine, he ended up going and winning the legit lineal title at middleweight against Sergio Martinez. And then he had a close fight against Canelo. That fight was close. So people underrate that as well. Close fight. So Kodo just did a lot of great things. But one thing he gave me as a boxing fan and why I was always a fan of his, as you saw it early on, great fighter, great technical fighter, offensive-minded fighter, underrated defense. So he was an elite top-level fighter, but he was vulnerable. And I love guys like that. It's why I say, like, if Tank moves up and steps up in competition, I'd be a Tank fan because Tank has those attributes. If he stepped up in competition, he could be a Miguel Cotto type of guy who can beat anybody. He has those attributes, but also, he has that talent, but also he's vulnerable. So other top level guys have things that could beat him, like Margarito, right? Cotto showed in his career that he was hurt multiple times. He had issues with Zab early in the fight. He had issues with Shane Mosley late in the fight. He had issues with Margarito late in the first fight. He had issues with Canelo back and forth in their fight. So for a great top-level fighter, elite fighter, he had vulnerabilities, and that's why I loved him as a boxing fan. He gave us moments. He gave us nostalgia. It was such a high level of skills fight. The two best boxers of the last 20 years say that Cotto was a beast. That's saying something. That's right. He gained the respect even in losses of Mayweather, Pacquiao. Cotto never had the love of the Ricans like Tito did. His demeanor was too quiet, while Tito was a man of the people. Who you got at 147? Cotto versus Tito. I think Tito by vicious KO. I've always been a Cotto guy. I've always been a Cotto fan. And I've always kind of trolled and said Cotto was better than Tito, and Cotto was the better Puerto Rican fighter. But Tito would have been an issue, a big issue for Cotto at 147 for the reasons that I just brought up. I think that left hook would have landed on Cotto a lot. And I'm not saying this would have been a wash. I think Cotto would have won rounds. I think Cotto would have made this a close fight. But I just think that left hook would have landed on Cotto's chin too much, and Tito would have been too much for Cotto at 147. So I just being honest, even though I want to pick Cotto, I got to pick Tito as the better overall fighter and better Puerto Rican fighter. And you're right, as far as the Puerto Ricans fans go, the Puerto Ricans were always more drawn to Tito. It was the pounding on the chest, wearing the Puerto Rican headband. It was all that stuff. So they took better to Tito, but Cotto still a great Puerto Rican legend. Battle of the Low Blows. So that's my spiel on Kodo. But another guy, being from the Gulf South like I am, one of the first fighters that I followed, if not the first, was Roy Jones. I remember my sister's ex-boyfriend being at the house. This was early 90s, and I was a young whippersnapper. And he's saying, you got to watch this dude from Florida fight. He walks into the ring wearing a tuxedo, and he turned it on. It was at his house because we didn't have cable at my house. And I'm watching this dude, and I'm just drawn to him. Like, he seemed like that type of dude that the dudes want to be and the girls want to be with, like that alpha figure. And he's just battering his competition. And I said, I got to follow this dude. I wasn't even a boxing fan at that time, but I got to follow this dude. And he was from our area. That was another big part of it that drew everybody down here to Roy. But if you look at Roy, 66-9, and it's like I was talking about, 30-year career. His career spanned 3 decades. He stuck around for about 15, 16, 17 years too long. And that's frustrating. That's the frustrating thing about it is some of these guys stick around too long. And that's what Roy did here. And it's what James Toney did as well. James Toney, a guy in the same induction class who just stuck around too long. James Toney, 29, 30-year career as well. So they start to rack up these L's against fighters that they shouldn't have had L's against. I mean, if you look at Roy had 2 rough spots, 3 straight losses, obviously. The Glenn Johnson loss sandwiched in between the 2 Antonio Tarver losses. Then he had a tough 3-fight run against Danny Green, Bernard Hopkins, and Lebedev. And then, by the way, the Danny Green loss, that was one of the saddest moments I've seen. Like, that was one of my saddest moments as a boxing fan, because even if I wasn't a fan of Roy Jones, just watching guys who don't belong in the ring at that point, and then seeing them against guys that should not even be fit to tie their shoelaces, like a Danny Green. And no offense to Danny Green, but it's like, this is Roy Jones. And then Danny Green knocks him out in the first round. It was just sad to watch Roy go down like that. One of the most shocking moments as a boxing fan, obviously, was the second Antonio Tarver fight. When Tarver knocked Roy out, I just remember watching, like, that was one of those moments. It's up there with Tyson, Douglas. Like, it's just one of those moments you remember, a little more than a handful of moments you remember as a boxing fan. You're like, wow. I'll always remember where I was watching that. That was shocking. Seeing Roy kind of stumble up and then fall on his side. And then the next fight, it's one of those sad moments. Watching him get planked by Glenn Johnson, like, that knockout, that was one of the nastiest knockouts. And Roy was knocked out several times late in his career, but that was probably the worst of them, the Glenn Johnson knockout. And it was just sad to watch. And then he fights Antonio Tarver again, has his moments in the fight, but for the most part, he took it. He was very safe in that fight. The Calzaghe loss was tough to watch as well because Calzaghe out Roy Jones. So there were frustrating moments late, but then you focus on the prime of his career. Prime Roy Jones. Nobody could say, I've never seen anything like prime Roy Jones. Nothing. I've never seen anything like it. I remember watching this guy in the 90s and like, how in the hell is somebody able to move like that? How is he able to throw punches that fast? Have punching power in both hands. Like, you're not supposed to be able to throw punches that fast with that much power. You're packing that much speed and that much power at the same time. Guys had no idea these punches were coming. Guys had no idea they'd be hit with the third shot and not even know that they were hit with the first shot yet. Different angles, the footwork, the fact that he was able to keep his hands down right in front of you and not get hit. His reflexes were second to none. He had it all. And he spanned it through multiple different weight classes, starting at middleweight, moving all the way up to heavyweight. Bernard Hopkins, that victory in the early 90s. James Toney, that victory in the mid-90s, his performance against James Toney, like, you want to see one of the greatest pure boxers of all time, one of the greatest boxing specimens of all time. Watch Roy Jones' performance against James Toney. It was just Jordan-esque. It was Jordan-esque. You watch Jordan's greatest game, greatest performance as a basketball player, that's Roy Jones against James Toney. Just phenomenal. Vinny Pazienza, that was one of my favorite fights. That's still one of my favorite fights to watch because you saw Pazienza trying. Like, Vinny Paz was trying so hard to land anything he could against Roy. Anything he could make stick. He was trying so hard. And then there was that moment where he would catch Roy with a couple of shots, and then Roy said, all right, enough of this. And Roy turned it in fifth gear. And Pazienza had no idea what was going on. Like, Roy was just boom, 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 boom. Take a break. Boom, 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 boom. Like, he was landing shot after shot, combination after combination on Pazienza. And it was a work of art. It was a work of art. Like, I've never seen anything before. I still haven't seen anything since like Roy in his prime. So it's an interesting dichotomy with his career. Like, it's an interesting experiment to do when you look at Roy's career. Because when you compare and contrast him to other great fighters, how do you weigh the fact that there was this 10-year period in which nobody could touch this guy? Nobody could come even close to touching this guy. But then if you take his whole 29-year career, you can't. I mean, we're talking about half of his career after the John Ruiz fight till he retires is half of his career. So how do we just discount that? How do we can't ignore that, is what I'm saying. A guy in what was it? 2 induction classes ago, Bernard Hopkins. It's always interesting to do that comparison. Like, Bernard Hopkins in his prime couldn't touch Roy. But if you look at the career as a whole, Hopkins' career overall is better than Roy's. So how do you weigh that? Which one do you go with on the all-time rankings? Do you go with Roy in his prime? Do you weigh it that much to where you put him above Bernard Hopkins? Or do you put Bernard Hopkins above Roy, given that throughout his career he was more consistent? It was a more even career. Whereas Roy's career was up, straight down. So it's interesting. Vargas was a champ already, but was too green for Tito. If you win a title, now you have to defend it no matter how inexperienced you are. So satisfying when Roy knocked out Montel Griffin in the rematch. That's what he gets for taking a dive in the first fight. And by the way, Montel Griffin beat James Toney twice, and James Toney being inducted into the Hall of Fame as well. But I think the Danny Green loss was hard to watch. That it was. I thought it, and still think Bernard Hopkins won both Taylor fights. A lot of people do. But look, Roy beat Tarver. He beat John Ruiz, moved up to heavyweight. If he ends his career, if he retires after the John Ruiz fight, where do we have him ranked all time then? It's an interesting conversation to have. I mean, Roy was a bad man. Clinton Woods, Eric Harding, I was at that fight. Virgil Hill knocking him out with a body shot after he avenges his loss to Montel Griffin, Vinny Pazienza, James Toney, Bernard Hopkins. Resume on top of the eye test. The eye test tells us that in his prime, Roy was probably the best fighter that we've ever seen. But what this induction class tells me as a whole, the story it tells is, I'm glad this induction class is getting inducted in, because it just tells us in this protect your O era that you could get, in Roy's case, 9 losses, James Toney's case, 10 losses and 3 draws, in Miguel Cotto's case, 6 losses. You can get multiple blemishes on your career. I think 25 total and 3 draws between the 3 of them, and still be inducted into the Hall of Fame, still being enshrined, the greatest achievement you can get as a boxer. And they did that by fighting top competition in their prime and even well after it. They were not afraid to take challenges. On top of that, the nostalgia of it. These guys gave us great moments. They gave us great victories, but they also gave us that opposite of it, right? The tough losses. We were able to relate to them as boxing fans. The underdog story and the up and down story are more relatable than a guy who is just a prodigy and retires undefeated. It's more relatable. So that's what this class gives us. So congratulations to Miguel Kodo, Roy Jones, James Toney on being inducted into the Hall of Fame. Great job. And as far as, once again, let's recap this weekend. Berlinga versus Angulo. That will get sketchy for Berlinga. It will get sketchy for Berlinga. Angulo is a tough fighter who will find you out if you're overvalued. And I think Berlinga is overvalued. So look out for that fight. That's upset alert. Kaiguchi versus Bermudez tonight on DAZN. Make sure to watch that fight for beautiful body punching in that fight. And that will turn into a war. So Kaiguchi versus Bermudez. Those are two good fights that are flying under the radar this weekend. This could end up being an underrated boxing weekend for us with some action. On that note, man, y'all make sure to hit that sub button if you're not subbed. I'm pushing in on 5K subs right now. And follow me on Twitter if you're not following me on Twitter at CalixBoxing2, because I'm also pushing in on 1K followers on Twitter. Marquez is getting into, or was that last year? So Marquez, you have 3 classes being inducted this year because of COVID. This is the first induction they've had in a couple of years. So you got Shane Mosley, Juan Manuel Marquez, Bernard Hopkins being inducted as far as modern fighters from 2020. 2021, Floyd Mayweather, Vlad Klitschko, Andre Ward. 2022, Roy Jones, James Toney, Miguel Cotto. And like I said, I'm going to bring some people on next week because I want to have an interesting conversation about how would you rank those 9 fighters, 1 through 9. I think that would be an interesting conversation to have. So on that note, man, I'm out. Y'all enjoy y'all's weekend. Enjoy the fights. I will be back on to recap some fights this weekend. God